I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Kenneth Lieberthal, who, as many of you know, was a professor here for many years. He's currently the Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy, Global Economy and Development, and also the John L. Thornton China Center at the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, where he served as director of the China Center from 2009 to 2012. He earlier taught at Swarthmore College and has a BA from Dartmouth College and two MAs and a PhD from Columbia University. Dr. Lieberthal served as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia on the National Security Council from 1998 through 2000 in the Clinton administration. And he's had many other positions throughout the years involving government service. I just want to mention a couple of his most recent publications, because if I read out all of his publications, we would be here until at least half past. His most recent books are the China's Political Development, co-editor with Yu Keping, which is out in Chinese and soon to be out also in English, from the Brookings Institution. And also from the Brookings Institution, Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy. And like I said, many other publications. Today he's going to be speaking to us on Xi Jinping and China's future prospects. I'm very happy to welcome him back to Ann Arbor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. It really is a wonderful feeling to come back to the University of Michigan and have a chance to again stand at this podium where I've been many times over many years. Let me look ahead to the coming 10 years of Xi Jinping's leadership. I would argue this will be a very consequential period for China. It will be a very consequential period for China because it became very clear, even before Xi became party secretary back in November of 2012, that China needed to change. This was a view of leftists and of rightists. It was a view of people across the spectrum in China. I spent quite a bit of time in China during the months leading up to the 18th Party Congress, and you could find nobody who didn't think that reform was pressing. The disagreement was over what reform should be carried out, and there was no agreement on that. Why was reform pressing? It's because the development model that China has pursued since the 1980s has run its course. It was enormously successful in producing, as you all know, annual real growth of GDP of roughly 10% per year. Absolutely startling. But it was based on a set of assumptions that were right at the time and are no longer sufficiently valid. These are assumptions such as popular tolerance for increasing inequality, corruption, and environmental degradation as simply the necessary cost that must be paid in transitioning to a new system. Not new meaning not party-led, but new in the sense of not Maoist, now much more market-centered and so forth. Right? Assumptions about the willingness of the international arena, willingness and capability of the international arena to keep absorbing rapidly growing levels of Chinese exports. Global financial crisis, among other things, changed those assumptions. It is also a model that was enormously resource intensive in terms of physical resources because it involved extensive growth with a focus on manufacturing, largely for the export, not largely, but substantially for the export sector, in a country that is dramatically short of physical resources. So, you could run with this for some period of time, but these assumptions became increasingly unsustainable. Let me say the fourth assumption, and in some ways the most consequential for China, is that China would continue to enjoy a virtually unlimited annual increment in young, cheap, flexible labor entering the urban labor force. But China's demographic pyramid gave the lie to that, so that age cohort now shrinks every year rather than growing every year. And you see the consequences in labor rates, demands of workers, and so on and so forth. By 2012, therefore, this model was producing increasing instability, increasing anger over extraordinary inequality in wealth, increasing anger over extraordinary levels of environmental degradation. I was just in Shanghai over the weekend. Let me say, the 2.5 particle level hit 625 when I was there. Even one of the major Shanghai papers on the front page had two pictures, one on top, one on the bottom. One on top, when you first look at it, just looks gray. The one on the bottom is skyscrapers, green hills in the background, blue sky, etc. And then the caption says these were taken from exactly the same place, one 2 weeks ago and one yesterday. Right? And if you look carefully at the one on top, you can see the vague outline of a couple of buildings. Right? For anyone who went back to Beijing from the conference I was in Shanghai, the 2.5 pollution level in Beijing was 425 when they arrived. Right? This is catastrophic. It's having consequences politically, socially, and also in terms of just public health that are extremely unsettling. So Xi Jinping faced a situation that demanded reform. No one was surprised that he would be a reformer. He couldn't be anything else and sustain things for long. He took the past year, since November of 2012 until the convening of what's called the third plenum this November, to work out what his reform program would actually look like. There's a lot of evidence that during the course of that year, he was pushed this way and that way. And so even real insiders tended to not be certain as to what directions he would go in at the end of the day. Third plenum is now convened. Third plenum put out a document called a resolution of the third plenum that has 60 points to it. It is a long document. For reasons that absolutely puzzle me, by the way, this is a fundamental document for the program in China. It's one of the very few such documents I've ever seen in the Chinese, published in Chinese and not translated into English. And the most widely circulated English translations are very poor. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's in that document, which our media are happy to pick up and run with, let me say. What can we tell about what Xi Jinping will do? And I draw this partly from what he's done over the past year, and partly from what's in this really quite extraordinary document. Okay? Let me do this in three terms. One is the overall political approach, secondly, the approach to the economy, and thirdly, the approach to society. Okay? For the overall political approach, Xi is determined to stay ahead of may be the wrong term, to shape and constrain popular expressions of discontent. And to do this in two ways. One is through increased repression of those who voice criticisms that he finds intolerable. He is no liberal. And second, to address some of the biggest sources of popular dissatisfaction. So this is not simply repression. This is repression and going after some issues that everyone has known for years are extremely important issues, but the previous administration of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao didn't have the courage to take on. Okay? On the repression side, there are draconian new rules on culpability for the consequences of things you post on social media. So that if you post something, it may be fairly innocent, but if it is reposted, I think 5,000 times, and if it leads to an evolution to some really bad stuff being posted, bad from the perspective of the leadership, you are criminally liable for that 5,000th iteration of it. That does make you a little bit leery about posting things, especially people with very large followings, right? And they've adopted a very tough approach to dealing with dissidents, arresting people, having them do public confessions on television before they've ever been subjected to a judicial proceeding. Within the party itself, Xi has initiated something that, frankly, we haven't seen in this form for decades. And this is a really scary rectification campaign. It's focused on corruption, but I've talked to quite a few officials now who have experienced it over the past year, and it has just scared the bejesus out of them. You know, earlier rectification campaigns over the last few decades, to me, highlighted how China had changed. I remember a rectification campaign, you know, they do these every few years. This was, I guess it was about a decade ago. And one of my friends in China showed me a website where, you know, at the end of a rectification, criticism and self-criticism, and then you write out your self-criticism, and once it's accepted, then you've kind of you've gotten through the gate, right? Yeah. And this was a website that had template self-criticisms. So you simply filled in your name and your position. You chose among a couple of options for what you were criticizing yourself for, right? And handed in, and these were being accepted, right? Of course, it costs you to download them. So this had become a business, right? Not in this rectification campaign. This one is really tough, and people are really running scared. Okay? So he's sharpened things a lot and added some tough energy to this. In terms of addressing popular demands, I would name 4 things that are significant, or at least prospectively quite significant. One, a shift de facto from a one-child to a two-child population policy. The new rule is, at least will be, I mean, they've announced that this will become the case, that if either of your parents is from a one-child family, then you may have 2 children. In urban China, it's hard to find a family where neither parent is from a one-child family. So effectively, it's shifting to a 2-child policy. Let me note, that still leaves the state intimately involved in reproduction, right? This is not an unlimited child family. And it will raise a lot of very tough issues about people who had a child very recently and then were sterilized. Can you reverse that and have another child? And the state will decide those issues, right? So it's not a liberal policy, but it's at least a minor adaptation to a policy that is widely disliked. Secondly, announcement that they will abolish reform through labor. This has been a policy that's existed for many decades, whereby local officials can incarcerate basically anybody for up to 4 years without any judicial process. And it's been used to handle all kinds of, vandals, vagrants, some dissidents, various types of things. If you read the fine print, what this also says, though, is that the implementation of this will be delayed until they develop appropriate other measures to handle these issues, right? And you don't know what those will be. Also, let me say, most of the media misreported this as saying China would abolish its labor camps. It will not. This is simply a totally administrative pathway to the labor camps for people who fall in this particular category. Prostitutes fall into labor camps by a totally administrative way, but it's not called reform through labor. So that will remain. So again, this is a limited liberalization, but it's affected so many people. There are about 100,000 people, I understand, who are currently incarcerated under these policies. And it's caused a lot of comment on social media in China. Basically, aren't we a more mature society than that? And so this, again, is something to appeal to people that this is more responsive. Thirdly, and to my mind, much more importantly, a reduction in the restrictiveness of the hukou system, the system whereby everyone has what amounts to, I'm simplifying a bit, but you're either an urban resident of China or a rural resident of China. If you're a rural resident and you move into the city, you remain a rural resident, which means that you lack many of the opportunities that urban residents have. It's been, economists tell me, the biggest single source of inequality, policy-based inequality in China. They are not abolishing this system. This is a staged reduction in the dimensions of the system, where effectively they say over time they'll abolish it for the smaller cities, restrict its use in various unspecified ways in medium-sized cities, but still strictly control immigration in the really big cities. Okay? And it will be up to local leaders to decide kind of where they fit, what the timing is, and what you have to do to become a full urban resident. You know, it may be something where you have to be a certain number of years, pay taxes for a certain number of period of time, or pay a fee, or whatever it may be. But still, this addresses one of the biggest sources of inequality in China, and one of the biggest sources of dissatisfaction in China. There are various other measures that they say they are adopting to equalize more, or at least reduce the inequality in rights between urban dwellers and rural dwellers in China. And this is a very pressing set of issues. Have to take questions on it later if you want. But anyway, it's really very significant. And then finally, there are some tantalizing indications that they want to enhance the independence of the judiciary and to assure fairer trials. On the independence of the judiciary, it seems mostly enhances independence from intervention by local government officials. And so the notion is you may put local courts under higher level authorities so the local officials, who may be corrupt as hell, can't intervene and drive the verdicts on people that they want to have dealt with a certain way. So it is not total independence, and it certainly is not independence from the party. But it is greater independence from local government. And that also has to be marked as some form of progress. And especially stating that people deserve fair trials. And so the trial procedures, torture should be banned, all kinds of things that we'll have to see how they're carried out in practice, but at least the sentiment is in the right direction. What I've suggested here is a very incomplete list. There's a lot more to say about this. But it's also very substantial. These are big issues. They're big issues that have festered for years, and this new leadership is saying, we're going to take these issues on. Okay? Second broad category, and the one that's gotten the most attention in the West, has been to outline a new conception of the role of the state vis-a-vis the economy and society. And this is really most of the content of this resolution of the third plenum. Aspirationally, it is really significant. Let me just run through briefly a selected list of the key objectives that they want to have in place by 2020. Okay? I'm not quite sure why they picked 2020, but it's beyond the current Politburo Standing Committee. 7 years is a long enough time. You can always find a lot of reasons to explain why something wasn't done, and most people have forgotten what you said anyway. But in any case, key objectives by 2020 include the following. One, have the market play a quote-unquote decisive role in the allocation of resources. Okay? That's vastly different from what they've ever said before. And it has huge implications. Second, put state and non-state property on an equal basis legally. They have not been equal legally to the present. Third, allocate credit without regard to whether the enterprises are state or non-state firms. To date, state-owned enterprises have had much cheaper access to more abundant credit than has the private sector. But what they're finding is the return on equity in the state sector is much lower than in the private sector. And so they now want to expand the capacity of private entrepreneurs to make this economy chug along. Right? And so they're saying they will give them equal access to credit. Frankly, all of this has to be implemented, which is, I'll take that up in a few minutes, but don't count on any of this being in the bank yet, but these are the directions. Also want to increase the role of market forces in determining interest rates, the renminbi exchange rate, the allocation of funds for research and development, which are currently allocated bureaucratically, and investment made by Chinese firms both domestically and internationally, which is to say take officials out of that process and let firms decide where they're going to put their money, right, and do it on a commercial basis. We want to increase the percentage of state-owned enterprises, the percentage of positions in state-owned enterprises that are filled by what they call commercial criteria. Currently, all top positions are filled by the party organization department, which makes the state-owned enterprises into bureaucratic organizations staffed by officials. Now they're saying we'll do it more on merit and the kinds of criteria that profit-making enterprises use around the world. They want to allow private capital and social capital into a lot of new areas where they've been largely or completely banned to date. Healthcare, education, media, state-owned enterprises, high-end services, and so forth. So they want to tap entrepreneurial talent and allow it to operate almost throughout the Chinese economy, including a lot of areas where it's been highly restricted by policy in the past. They also want to reduce dramatically the array of economic activities that require government approval, because, as they will readily note, every government approval is an opportunity for rent-seeking behavior by the government official who does the approval, right? So one way to reduce corruption is to reduce the number of approvals required. They want to increase and regularize the sources of funding for local governments. One of the big problems since 1994, when they last did a major restructuring of the tax system, is that local governments have increasingly been allocated unfunded mandates. So obligations to do stuff, but without the money behind those obligations to actually pay for doing it. And of course, that has led local governments into all kinds of gray zones in terms of how to raise the money. A lot of this has very bad consequences for peasants who live under the jurisdiction of those governments, bad consequences for the environment, bad consequences for anyone who wants to reduce corruption, and so forth. So they want to regularize things by giving local governments clearer and more sufficient sources of legal funding, including the capacity to borrow money, but through an above-the-table system rather than under-the-table system. And so, make this into a cleaner government. The list goes on. I've just barely scratched the surface with the array of things that I've just named. The fundamental focus is to have the government limit itself more to the roles governments play in advanced industrial countries. In other words, to have the government maintain macroeconomic stability, optimize public services, guarantee fair competition, provide for market supervision and management, safeguard market order, and promote sustainable development, environmentally sustainable development. And broadly, to shrink back the role of the state. One of my favorite policy initiatives of the 1980s that disappeared in 1989 was a thing that in Chinese are called 政企分开, the separation of government from enterprise. That is now in vogue again. Okay? And it's the notion that enterprises actually should act as independent enterprises, not simply as extensions of various government agencies. Third, there are a number of measures regarding society. Let me put that in broad terms, because I do want to leave time for Q&A. I think of China somewhat this way. Before the death of Mao Zedong, politics was all that mattered. Right? If you want to drive outcomes, politics drove outcomes. Under the reforms of Deng Xiaoping and then Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, you had to add the market to that. So politics plus markets drove outcomes. Now they've made a decision that this place has changed enough, has such a large middle class, social media and so forth, that you now have to have politics plus markets plus society drive outcomes, and figure out ways to have society from the bottom up organize, take on responsibilities, deal with a variety of issues. They want to develop charitable capabilities, health care, environmental things, and so forth, on a scale quite different from what they've done before. Frankly, as I read this resolution, as Mary mentioned, I served in the Clinton administration. One of the things I got involved in every year in the Clinton administration was making up the State of the Union address of the president, where I learned how a State of the Union address is composed. This is the address given every January by the president, look-ahead address. And what it is the president articulates some broad themes that are his program, right? I mean, this is the general direction in which things should go. And then every major agency gets one sentence to one short paragraph in the address to put down what they would love to do, right? And then the president stands up and reads the whole thing. I'm serious. I mean, that's the way these things are put together. That's the way this resolution reads, which is to say the broad themes are Xi Jinping's themes. I mean, these are the directions in which he wants to move. And effectively, he gave every agency 2 to 3 sentences for its leading reformers to state what they would love to see happen in the next 7 years. And it's all there. Not how to do it. Not anything operational. But That's our program, right? Be inspired, right? So it's significant here that she has very clearly associated himself with this. In fact, extraordinarily, they put out a separate document that was on the drafting of this resolution, and the document mentions Xi Jinping, I think, 50 times, or some very dozens of times, and never mentions another person. Right? So this is totally identified with Xi's concept, leadership, pushing the process, getting this outcome, right? This is where I stand. But this is a very long way in the Chinese system, or frankly in any political system, from what you need to do to make anything happen. In China, people listen to policies and say, oh, I have to be aware of that. But what changes behavior is actual laws, regulations, details on changes in procedures, measurements of outcomes that you are rewarded or punished for. Those are the things that change behavior. And virtually none of those has been put forward. So virtually every one of these initiatives is going to require a serious policy process to work out specific measures and regulations before they can produce real results. That's what we look forward to now. I mean, now, I've heard some commentators say, oh, we now know what will happen in China. No, we don't. We now know that the game has started. They've just gotten over the starting line. They've indicated where they want to end up. Now the fun begins. Okay? So what can we tell about Xi's operational strategy? Frankly, there's still a lot that we're going to have to see about, but I think we can make a couple comments. One is he is you've heard of the Cola, he is the Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao was a consensus builder who always hid his own views and that kind of thing. She is in the strong leadership mold, right? Very bold, gets his personal views out, articulates things not in terms of just one slogan after another, but in terms that people can really understand, and takes credit, as with the drafting of this document. So he has increased dramatically his personal authority within the Standing Committee of the Politburo. For Hu Jintao, there's a 9-member standing committee. The standing committee would discuss a policy decision, and if anyone at the end of that discussion said they could not agree with the others, who would table it? Instead of going with a majority, even a supermajority, either we had a consensus or we don't make a decision. And the result of that, by the final years of his governance, was they made no decisions. All the decisions on structural reforms were put aside, and instead they spent money to try to tide things over to let the next administration deal with the tough issues. Well, the next administration has arrived, and Xi's view is, I'm going to take them on big time, okay? Not by consensus. Secondly, and very importantly, a lot of this sounds kind of quasi-liberal, right? We're going to reduce the role of the government. We're going to have the market play a decisive role. We're going to increase the use of various kinds of social organizations and bottom-up things. In other areas I haven't talked about, we're going to increase the role of foreign capital, et cetera, et cetera. Just a lot of stuff that sounds pretty good. In fact, if you look at the economic side of this, it's hard to find anything they put forward that the U.S. government has not been encouraging them to do for the last decade. So I mean, it's kind of the ideal program from a U.S. point of view. What is also emphasized, but what hasn't garnered as much attention abroad, is that core to all of this is the party's role increases. The party becomes more centralized, stronger, more decisive, more disciplined, less corrupt, and shapes the outcomes, okay, in all aspects of society. So, and he's seeking to accomplish this through this traditional method of rectification and, purges over corruption and that kind of thing. Let me tell you how there are almost no areas where they have as yet announced specific changes where you can actually see that something will operate differently. One of the few areas they've done that in is the Party Discipline Inspection Commission. This is the internal party system for ferreting out corruption and other violations of party discipline among party members. Right? And you know, a lot of people thought they would have to establish some independent institution to really go after corruption, because the party's thoroughly corrupt. What they've done instead is to put some really tough people in charge of this thing. There are these discipline inspection commissions at in every territorial political unit in China. You know, not only at the center, but at every province, every city, every county, every township. Right? The key thing about those discipline inspection commissions, while they are very tough organizations, is that the ones they report to are the local party leadership. So the city discipline inspection commission reports to the city party committee. But where's the source of corruption? The city party committee, right? So it's a great way to make sure you can't upset the apple cart, right? They've just made a change. It's a change that they've discussed for years, and she just pushed it through. Now, each of those discipline inspection commissions reports to its counterpart body one level up the system. So the city commission will report to the provincial commission. And the membership of that commission will be determined at the next level up, not at the same level. That makes these guys really scary. Okay? So it makes it much tougher. I mean, it shows they're really serious about this. I would argue is not as good as creating something like an independent commission against corruption or something like that, some institutionalized extra party body to go after this. But and it's very hard to find other areas where they have actually indicated concretely structural changes that they're going to make in how the place is governed to give concrete embodiment to these broad aspirational things. And there are some announced changes in government policy objectives that, to my mind, seem far from being institutionalized or operationalized even conceptually. To me, the biggest one here, when people ask me, you know, what's the biggest problem they face? Is it the pushback from big state-owned enterprises whose interests may well be hurt by this? You know? And my feeling is the biggest problem they face is that there are 40,000 territorial political units in China, right? Townships, counties, cities, and provinces, each headed by two top guys, party secretary and the governor or mayor or whatever it is, the government equivalent of that. So you have 80,000 officials in 5 layers of government whose incentives are very much not to change the way the system works now. They have done great the way the system works now. And how you work through 80,000 people in 5 different levels spread across a continent and get changes in behavior, the only way you can do it is to change the incentives. All the incentives now are for these guys to operate in terms of, to prioritize big capital intensive projects, because that puts a lot of funds together from which to skim, to focus on GDP growth every year, because that's one of the key measures for eventual evaluation of performance and therefore promotion. A whole series of things that have been key to China's dynamic growth to date and are now increasingly problematic. Right? Well, they list, what they say in this document is, well, we have to take away the focus on GDP growth, take away the focus on big, very jazzy projects, and instead we have to incentivize, and then they give a list of about 15 things. Well, I'm sorry, you can't incentivize 15 things. Where you have 15 things, no one knows what the incentive is, right? And they just haven't figured it out. They haven't even begun to come to grips with this. And until they do, these folks are going to keep operating largely the way they've been operating. It may look a little different on the surface, but underneath, China is a kind of Shangbanfa, Chabuduo type society, for those who speak Chinese. There's always a way, okay? I think in the economy, for that particular component, he's likely to lead off with changes in the financial system, because those are the changes that are bureaucratically easiest. You can change interest rates by a decision at the very top among a few people, and yet it can ripple throughout the entire economy. So you can leverage that kind of decision very easily without having to build a consensus among a lot of different interests in order to do it, right? Or even to implement it. Right? And we'll see various local experiments like this Shanghai Special Trade Zone that was launched about a month and a half ago to a lot of fanfare. They're reducing the number of items that need central level approval. I think, frankly, two of the things that potentially will play a big role here in pushing these reforms forward. This will be a couple of years from now and may or may not happen. But as I talk to leaders in China, what they'll say privately is two big things potentially for them are one, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this multilateral trade agreement that the U.S. and a bunch of other countries are now trying to negotiate. China is not a part of that at this point, but Japan is. South Korea is likely to join. Many of the major Asian countries are in it. If that goes through, this will be a high-quality trade and investment platform, multilateral around Asia. What some of the Chinese leaders are talking about now is, gee, if that does get established, we ought to negotiate our way into it. And we ought to regard that negotiation the way Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji regarded negotiating their way into the WTO 10 years ago. I had the privilege of participating in that negotiation. I saw what happened as they grapple with these issues. It was absolutely abundantly clear. And Zhu Rongji has subsequently said this to me explicitly, that they used WTO entry to get the leverage they felt they needed to make the domestic changes that otherwise they didn't think they had the political leverage to implement. So they were willing to take on very tough obligations and then turn around and leverage an international agreement with arbitration clauses in and all that kind of stuff in Switzerland in order to carry out domestic reform in China. That is one of the ways TPP is being seen now. Now, TPP hasn't been finalized, so it may not occur. The other thing is a bilateral investment treaty between the U.S. and China, which is now in a more active stage of negotiation. The Chinese have agreed effectively to put everything on the table, access to every place on the table, with only a few exceptions. Their former approach was to have nothing on the table unless they make an exception and put it on the table. So it's a very different way of doing things, right? And again, the idea there is to undermine what's called the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, by taking the conditions and requirements for investment out of their hands. Okay? So major change, but leveraging an international negotiation in order to get that major change. I think, frankly, and let me wrap up in 3 minutes now, kind of summary. I think Xi faces probably his toughest challenges in terms of social policy. When you sit back and think about it, he is seeking to use authoritarian political power of an authoritarian party, to shape the demands and activities of an increasingly educated, mobile, networked middle class. That's going to be very tough. He's also going to encounter a lot of complexities in terms of inherent contradictions between different parts of the program that he is now promoting. Let me give you an example. They want to dramatically expand the role of the market. And they want to also assure greater fairness in distribution of wealth. Well, I hate to tell you, but markets don't always produce fairness in distribution of wealth. Right? I mean, hello. Right? So these things all sound good, but getting them to work well is a different level of task. He wants to improve the environment. Part of the effort to do that is they've said they will, I'm sure they'll do this in a series of steps, but will stop controlling prices for water, energy, and other natural resources. Well, those prices will go up by quite a bit. The problem is, when they've gone up, there's going to be a long time between the rise in those prices, which is going to disadvantage a lot of especially poorer people, right, and improvements in the environment. The lag there is going to be quite a few years. How you manage the tenor of that lag is not going to be easy to work out. And then also, as these things take effect, China will change. So that the policies designed to really resonate with China now will be dealing with a different China 5 years from now. Not 100% different, but significantly different. So rather than go through a whole bunch of conclusions I was going to reach, let me sum up as follows. For those of you who follow this, I'm sure you've seen a lot of commentary that kind of compares the third plenum a month ago with the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in 1978 that Deng Xiaoping came to the fore and is widely seen as the beginning, the turning point from the Maoist system to the reform era. I think a lot of the commentary must be written by people who were not following Chinese politics in 1978. I was. It was less dramatic then. It was much less clear. My own view is Deng Xiaoping was a genius. He had a huge impact on the course of the history of the largest country in the world. That's not easy. But his genius was not in specifying 60 things that he was going to reform. He frankly had a very vague idea of any of the specifics. He knew a broad direction in which he wanted to move China. His genius was in the ensuing 15 years to manage the politics of the reform effort so that he could, on balance, keep things moving basically in the right directions over time, having to pull back for years at a time, having to fight even with some of his closest colleagues. It was managing the politics of all this that was crucial. That was his real genius, avoiding a collapse of the entire system while the system gradually changed, right? My own sense is that will be the real test for Xi Jinping. Nobody knows how all this is going to come out. A lot of it isn't going to work the way it's planned. It's like the old line about military strategies. Battle plans are always worked out in great detail, and they become obsolete after the first hour of battle because the situation's changed in ways no one anticipated, and so you have to adapt, right? And the question is whether Xi will have the kind of enormous political skill that will be necessary to, on balance, move China in the directions that he has indicated. My own hope is that he will do well with that, but I think it's going to be a fascinating decade to watch. Okay, thank you very much. We still have about 10 minutes. Happy to take questions on any of this. Yeah. Okay.